Hello everyone, welcome to Faith Gateway Africa. Today we are going to examine what biblical studies is and the various approaches to which scholars or people in general do biblical studies. Now, biblical studies is the academic study of the Bible so that we can get the meaning that the original writers intended to espouse in their letters. It's a scientific study of the Bible that leads to the evolution of new knowledge. Generally, there are three main ways of doing biblical studies. 1. Those who locate the meaning of the text in the world behind the text. 2. Those that locate the meaning of the text in the world within the text. And 3. Those who locate the meaning of the text in the world in front of the text. We are going to examine these three major ways of doing biblical studies so that we can get the best meaning out of it. Let's start with the first category of people. Those who locate the meaning of the text in the world behind the text. These are people who generally look at the historical part of Scripture. What was the historical background behind any portion of Scripture? So they engage what we call historical critical methodologies. And there are many historical critical methodologies. But for the purpose of our discussion, we are going to look at two of them. 1, we are going to look at source criticism. 2, we are going to look at form criticism. But there are others, as I've said, there are other historical critical methodologies. There are text criticisms, there are also historical criticisms. So let's move on to the first one. 1, source criticism. The major question source critics asked in doing biblical studies is that what source or sources was or were available to the biblical writers in their writing of the various portions of Scripture? Were they privy to an information, and based on the information they were privy to, they espouse what they did in Scripture? For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 to 26, Apostle Paul quotes from an early Christian liturgy. He also appears to have incorporated a Christian hymn to his letter to the Philippians. The gospel writers also appear to have had a source that they used and dwelt on in their writing of the gospel. So basically, that's what the source critics look at. They look at the source or sources available to the various biblical writers when they were writing their various portions of Scripture. Number 2, form criticism. Form criticism is also an example of a historical critical methodology. For them, they look at the form, the literary genre in which the various portions of Scripture were written. So, be it genealogy, be it parables, be it narratives, or any other form in which we find various passages of Scripture, they try to study the various forms and see how best they can derive meaning out of these various forms. Sometimes they try to reconstruct these forms or these passages to give the various thoughts they want to espouse. Number 2, those who locate the meaning of the text in the world within the text. The presupposition underlining these people's claim is that you would only get the meaning of a text within the text and not outside the text. They use a method we call exegesis. Now, there's a difference between exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is deriving the meaning from the text. The intended meaning of the authors, you are deriving it from the text. Eisegesis is bringing your own meaning from outside the text into the text. And exegesis requires knowledge of many things, such as the biblical languages, the Jewish, Semitic, and Greco-Roman backgrounds. How to determine the original text when early copies, when I say early copies, I mean those produced by hand, have differing readings. The use of primary sources and tools such as good Bible dictionaries and commentaries. Number 3, those who locate the meaning of the text in the world in front of the text. The use of this methodology creates space for Bible readers to bring their own points of view and concerns to the text and so may end up with differing meanings. It is reader-centered, and it is based on the presupposition that once the text leaves the hand of the author's intention and entire matrix of originating circumstances leave any claim of being constitutive of meaning. Those who use this method swing the pendulum of interpretive emphasis to the direction of the reader's role in the construction of meaning. The methodology finds support in what Murray says about biblical interpretation, that it has never been without references to or dependent on a particular cultural code, thought pattern, or social location of the interpreter. An example of this method is African biblical studies, which makes Africa's sociocultural context a subject of interpretation. And it has an offshoot which is mother tongue biblical hermeneutics. The argument is that God's revelation did not drop in heaven from parachutes, but God's revelation came to a particular people called the Jews, and through a particular person called Jesus Christ. That notwithstanding, for those of us who are not in the Jewish context, the Bible material or the biblical material must be profitable to us. So we must bring it into our cis in Lebanon, our situation in life setting, so that we can get the best out of it. As Africans, how can the biblical materials be of use to us? As Europeans, how can the biblical material be of use to them in their own context? In this lecture, we have looked at what biblical studies is and the three major ways of doing biblical studies, which are those who locate the meaning of the text in the world behind the text. 2, those who locate the meaning of the text in the world within the text. 3, those who locate the meaning of the text in the world in front of the text. Until we meet next time, stay blessed. Bye-bye.